One of the most important decisions you will need to make in Helldivers 2 is which primary weapon to take with you out on the battlefield. The role of the primary weapon is to be the main thing that's at your side at all times, and so it's gotta be reliable and capable of serving swift justice to at least most of democracy's enemies. And at first, when this game came out, these guns didn't really live up to that name, but Arrowhead has since introduced and rebalanced many of these primary weapons and brought the game back from the brink of collapse. But after so many changes, we now have to sift through and decide which of these primary weapons are the best and which are the worst. Dr. Pooplove here, and that's what I hope to find out. In this video, I will be testing all of the primary weapons and re-ranking them again now that the balancing has mostly settled down, with S being the best and Poop Hater being the worst. But we aren't just going to be doing one tier list. No, we need to do two tier lists because weapons will be very different depending on whether you are facing off against the Terminids or the Automatons. Starting with a basic AR-23 Liberator, an assault rifle which has all around decent stats. It has a nice low recoil and a high fire rate, and this has received a number of buffs, largely in the form of damage, but also with smaller things like horizontal recoil. This also has a slight stagger force as well, but not a huge one. This gun is pretty vanilla. It's kind of boring, but versus the bugs, I actually like this quite a bit. You can take most of the bugs out fairly quickly with precision, and the damage buffs that this has received, in addition to some of the enemy nerfs, definitely makes this gun much more manageable and makes the enemies fall more quickly. It's definitely not the strongest gun, and it only has light armor penetration, so it's not the best versus enemies like the Hive Guards, but this does get the job done, especially versus most of the bugs who are lower in armor levels. This won't blow your mind, but it can be taken out for sure, and it's probably fitting that the basic starter gun sits right about average, and so I'm going to be giving this a, well, wait, hold on one second. Just a quick disclaimer here. These rankings are based on my experience with these guns, and they're not meant to be taken super seriously. While I am trying to make a useful guide that's helpful for most Helldivers, there's no way we're going to agree on everything, and this is not a perfect science, and it never will be. But I do welcome some healthy debate in the comments. All right, so the Liberator gets a poop tier. Flush this thing straight down. No, I'm just kidding. This will get a B for the bugs. Now for the bots, where the Liberator does have some strengths in that it does have that low recoil, allowing you to fire this thing at range. It also has decent durability damage, which makes it a little bit easier to face off against Berserkers and Devastators. Ultimately though, the light armor penetration level is a lot more consequential when you're facing off against the bots, who are pretty well armored up, a lot more so than the bugs. So this requires you to do a lot more precision, and some enemies you just really can't do anything at all against. It's really hard to actually recommend this. It's not total poop though, so I will be giving it a C. But next we have one of the most interesting guns to take a look at now, and that is the AR-23P Liberator Penetrator, which was a lower damaging assault rifle with a medium armor penetration and low recoil. It definitely was one of the worst guns for a while. It felt like it was just tickling enemies, and it had a very low mag size, so you were constantly reloading. But this has received both a damage buff and a magazine buff, which have really helped this gun tremendously. Versus the bugs, it does feel quite a bit better. It damages the enemies much more, and you're no longer really feeling like you have to constantly reload. The medium armor penetration though does come less in handy versus the bugs, as it's only really going to help you with Hive Guards and Bile Spewers. But this is no longer poop tier versus the bugs where it used to be. It's still not great, like it's sort of a trade-off of damage versus armor penetration versus the base assault rifle, but you can take this out and you can do well with it. So I will be giving it a B versus the bugs. Now versus the bots, the changes here are much better. The medium armor penetration means you can take this out and face off against most bots, and the fact that this has lower recoil makes it a much more precise and viable assault rifle pick. It definitely feels a lot nicer taking this out, and I love that you can make quick work of the Striders and Devastators, especially with the higher magazine size means you're not going to have to constantly reload. I will say this has crept up to being an A for the bots. But let's move on to another member of the Liberator family, and that is the AR-23C Liberator Concussive. And I am a fan of this gun because while it dishes out bullets at a much slower rate than the other assault rifles, each bullet packs a very concussive punch that staggers things back very strongly. Versus the bugs, I like this because when facing off against the horde, it makes you practically untouchable. As the swarm is trying to get close, you can just pump them with a bullet and push them back. The added magazine size with the drum makes it so you can do this for a much longer period of time as well, although I will say the reload is pretty fast, so even though you won't need to do it as much, that won't hurt you that much. This pairs pretty well with crowd clearing items like the Impact Incendiary, or what I really love to do is pair this with the Crisper Flamethrower sidearm, allowing me to light the ground on fire and then kind of keep the enemies corralled around it, lighting them up. That being said, it still has some downsides in that its damage and its fire rate being a little lower means you're going to be dishing out damage at a much slower rate, and the fact that you probably do need to rely more on pairing this with other items in order to make it feel worth it. But I do like this as a horde management weapon. It serves well in specifically that niche, and so I will give it a B for the bugs. Now moving on to the bots, where the stagger can be good, but it's much less effective overall. It does very well versus the berserkers, keeping them back, and the shielded devastators, as well as being able to stop the rocket devastators. This can be a good sort of dedicated attack suppressor, but it doesn't offer much more than the base Liberator, being that it's still light armor penetrating. And honestly, when it comes to the bots, I would rather eliminate them quicker with something with more damage, as yeah, you can stagger some, but that often just leaves you open to others. It's not the best, so I'll be giving it a C for the bots. But now let's move on to another member of the Liberator family, the AR-23A Liberator Carbine, which shares a lot of the same traits as the base Liberator, but firing at a much faster rate at the cost of more recoil. And it does have this little baggie in the side, which means this can also double up quite fashionably as your purse. And out of all the Liberator family of assault rifles, I do find this to actually be the best versus the bugs. It kills these things super fast, and you will have a lot more close range combat, so the recoil limitation is really only felt at longer range. You can hip fire this when enemies are really close, and if you do need to go at range, you just need to control the burst a little bit. I like this for the bugs. I will be giving it an A. But unlike the bugs, this absolutely sucks versus the bots. It shares all of the same criticisms that I have for the base Liberator, except it has more recoil, which means you are limited even further by your range. And since the main workaround you have for light armor penetration is to be more precise, this is just not going to serve you that well. Maybe versus the berserkers, it can help you take them out a little quicker, but that's about it. This is poop tier, get flushed carbine. Now, sticking with assault rifles, but outside of the Liberator family, we have the AR-61 Tenderizer, which is a very low recoil but high damaging assault rifle. And this also has the ability to modify the RPMs or fire rate of this weapon. And I gotta say, this feels very solid. It has great precision and it has high damage and it handles great, even dishing out a little bit of stagger. Versus the bugs, it feels amazing because it does pack that punch and it makes you feel powerful. And being able to switch to a higher RPM means you'll be able to dish out high damage faster to the enemies. The main drawback of this weapon is really the slow reload, which you can counter if you reload a little early before you exhaust the entire mag. It's a very solid pick. It feels strong and amazing versus the bugs, so I'll be giving it an A. Now versus the bots, this gun is also great. Despite only having light armor penetration, the accuracy and low recoil on this thing combined with a higher damage leads to enemies falling pretty quickly and pretty nicely. Being able to modify the RPMs to the slower rate of fire helps stay on target and get your damage in. Generally though, it's just nice to have a lot of options with this thing. The precision of this allows for headshotting or hitting weak spots in enemies, including those rockets on the rocket striders, which can help take them out on level 8 and up, or even headshotting the striders from level 7 and down. These can be some decent workarounds, letting precision work to your benefit and still getting a lot of these medium armor enemies quickly. And now that you are able to wield things like the Senator and the Verdict, the Tenderizer becomes a little bit more of a viable pick to take with you. It's still not enough. Like, it's very hard for me to want to put a light armor penetrating weapon as an A, but I think it will get a high B versus the bots for for me. But next we have the BR-14 Adjudicator, which is a medium penetrating assault rifle with a pretty high recoil. And it's a pretty solid gun. It initially started out kind of weak, but it's received some buffs, and in particular, it's received some damage and mag size buffs. And versus the bugs, I really like this. The damage is very high, and coupled with the higher mag size now, you will find that you are dealing a good bit of damage out and mitigating a lot of the former criticism of this gun. This is very solid, and it's going to do the trick versus the bugs that have medium armor penetration as well, such as the Hive Guards and the Bile Spewers. It's a very nice advantage to have, and it generally just feels good to take with you on the battlefield. Just make sure if you're a little bit at range to counter the recoil with some pulse firing, but ultimately this is going to get an A for the bugs. Now versus the bots, I know a lot of people really like this, and I will say I have finally come around to this gun. The medium armor penetration is of course very welcome with this gun, and it really does do well versus enemies like the Devastators. The recoil does hurt this a bit, requiring you to crouch or use recoil reducing armor if you're trying to use this as an assault rifle at range. But interestingly enough, this actually used to be classified as a marksman rifle, and I feel like versus the bots, it actually should be treated as one. Just switch the fire rate to semi-auto firing, and with the higher damage now, as well as the mag size, you will find that you're able to deal with the enemies quite nicely and get on target relatively well. In this way, it's sort of like a faster firing version of the counter sniper or something like that. Ultimately, it just feels good, and I really like it now, and so I will be giving it an A versus the bots. Now next up we have the R2124 Constitution, and this bolt action marksman rifle was gifted to us Helldivers on Liberty Day, and it is a relic of pre-democratic times. Now despite being more of a ceremonial gun, this does have some interesting stats. It has medium armor penetration as well as rounds reload, and it also has a bayonet allowing for increased melee damage. And versus the bugs, I'll be honest, this does certainly struggle a bit. The slow firing makes it pretty hard to really make an impact on the horde, but the damage and the armor penetration levels certainly do help. And additionally, it's nice to just be able to get a few good melees out there, which can be even stronger if you're using the peak physique perk. This won't be able to defend you too long though if you're trying to melee the whole horde. Now, clearly, this was one time an S tier gun years ago. But these days, it's more of a ceremonial gun or kind of a meme gun meant to challenge the will and the might of Helldivers looking to up the difficulty. As such, I will have to put this in the poop tier category, but in the most respectable way possible. I actually wouldn't want any buffs or anything changed to this. I think it properly serves its purpose in reminding us of the Helldivers that came before us and the technology that they used to have to wield. Now, as we move on to the bots, I will say there is actually a slight increase in viability here. The medium armor penetration makes this much more serviceable versus most of the enemies, and it can even get the Devastators in a single headshot. The bayonet requires you to get pretty close, and so it's not going to come in as much handy versus the bots, and the slower fire rate of course is going to hurt it a little bit as well. Although this is kind of a meme gun, I do actually like the idea of Arrowhead one day releasing a very similar high-powered version of this one day, maybe dealing out tons of damage and heavy armor penetration, but definitely I don't want them to actually change anything on this rifle. In fact, as a relic of history, it would be weird to kind of touch this at all. Anyways, this does get some good marks for sure on the bot front, saving it from a double poop ranking, and so I will be giving it a C versus the bots. Now for the R63 Diligence Marksman rifle, and you would not expect this to be good versus the bugs because marksman rifles imply precision and accuracy, and that doesn't bode too well versus the horde. But I do have to say I like this quite a bit. This thing has good damage which punches through bugs very well, and having good precision means if you enjoy these types of guns, which I very much do, this will be a great choice. The main downside though is in panic situations when you're close to the horde, you aren't going to really be able to be that precise, and so you may want something that's going to have your back a little bit more for those situations. I really like this gun, but I go back and forth on whether it should get an A or a B, but more likely it should get a B versus the bugs. Now versus the bots, this does have more advantages in that yes, it is useful at range where you will be facing bots more often, and it actually does pretty well here. It does of course have a disadvantage in that this is only light armor penetrating, but at least being precise allows you to more easily get those lower armor weak spots, and because it has good damage, you can also do things like one-shot headshot the Devastators, which makes this a good gun for precision. It actually does feel pretty good for the bots, but it's really hard to recommend over the next gun we will be talking about. That's why for me, I think it ultimately gets a B for the bots. But now let's move on to the R63 CS Diligence Counter Sniper. And this is a medium armor penetrating brother of the Diligence, which does lead to some differences between both factions. For the bugs, I actually think this fares worse than the Diligence because although you do have medium armor penetration, the mag size is a bit smaller here and the handling is slower, and so it just makes it less usable against most of the bugs at closer ranges. Sure, if you do have some distance, you can snipe well with this thing, but ultimately I don't think that's going to help that much. I would still prefer having the base Diligence if that's what you're trying to go for. I will be giving this a C versus the Terminids. Now, unlike the bugs, the Diligence CS is actually very amazing for the bots. It has impactful medium armor penetrating shots, which go a long way versus these robotic menaces, allowing you to take on pretty much every enemy and doing so with precision and packing a nice punch. It also fires pretty fast when you need it to if you get in a jam when enemies get close, and so that provides some nice versatility. If anything, honestly, I wish this just dealt out a little bit more damage versus a lot of the bigger enemies like the gunships and the tank vents, because you do end up having some explosive weapons that kind of outshine it in this regard. It's hard to give it an S, but this really does deserve a high A versus the bots. Okay, but let's move on to the MP98 Knight, which is the bonus weapon that you get for buying the Super Citizen edition of this game. This is a very super high fire rate SMG with a good amount of recoil. It's one-handed, of course, which is the advantage of SMGs, and I will say this is a solid option versus the bugs as it operates very similar to the Liberator Carbine with some minor trade-offs between the two in their stats. To me, it's really just a matter of how much you can control the pulse firing of this thing and maintain control of the weapon. But one advantage that this does have over the Carbine is that you do have the one-handed perk, so you can also fire while running away, which is a nice advantage to have. And so I will give this an A versus the bugs. It's pretty solid. Now versus the bots, you might as well just give up. This suffers from the same reasons as the Liberator Carbine with its lack of range, and although you do get the extra benefit of being able to use this with a ballistic shield and use that to even close the distance a little bit, it doesn't really help that much, and you will be firing missing shots like a big pooper. This is poop tier for sure. All right, next up is the SMG 32 Reprimand, and this one is interesting and kind of weird, perhaps also a little bit disappointing, but it actually isn't bad. So let me explain. This is an SMG, but it is not one-handed, and that is kind of weird in that, well, I thought one of the main things that sets SMGs apart is that they do have the one-handed perk. Now, the description also calls this heavy duty, and some of the marketing also describe this using the word heavy, and so at first I thought this was going to be a heavy armor penetrating primary, something that we don't have yet, unless you count the torture, of course. And I will say I was kind of looking forward to that. It's something that I would have welcomed because I don't think it's bad to actually have a heavy primary. Weapons like that just need some sort of downsides to not overshadow the stratagems. In a similar way to how the Senator can do good work on the heavies, but it has low capacity and requires great precision. Anyways, instead, this SMG has high damage, high recoil, and a slow fire rate, as well as medium armor penetration. And when you're taking this out on the battlefield, to be honest, it really doesn't feel much like an SMG, especially because it doesn't have that one-handed perk. Instead, this actually feels a little bit more like a variant of the Adjudicator, swapping a little bit higher damage for less capacity and a little bit more recoil. And versus the bugs, this actually just feels very similar to the Adjudicator. Like, it wrecks them quickly. It can deal with medium armor, and just pulse firing and controlling the recoil a little bit allows you to fire this at longer ranges. Now, technically on paper, this actually will output more damage per mag than the Adjudicator. But despite that, I did feel a tiny bit weaker with this, probably just because my bullets ended up overkilling some enemies, so I found myself reloading quite a bit. It's definitely still strong though, and it really takes the enemies out nicely. And honestly, it's really just too close to the Adjudicator to not really keep it around the same level. I do prefer the Adjudicator though, so I will give it a slightly lower A for the bugs. Now for the bots, again, I think you just need to treat this more like the Adjudicator. And by that, I mean kind of as a marksman rifle. The recoil in full auto is kind of too much to deal with the bots who you're going to be facing mostly at range, so definitely switching off of that mode is recommended. In semi-auto firing, this will get the medium guys nicely, and it's even going to do things like one-shot the Devastators. But another consideration here is using the burst firing pattern to deal out more damage per trigger pull, firing off 3 shots, and if you can just control that fire pattern, you can make much faster work of the enemies. All in all, it really does feel pretty solid here, and I do like it on the bot front. Again though, this is very similar to the Adjudicator, and really I think it's just going to depend on your preference, so I will be giving it an A for the bots. But moving on, we have the SMG 37 Defender. It's a pretty solid gun with a lower fire rate than the Knight, and it does dish out more damage. Now this is also pretty comparable to the base Liberator, although it does have some slightly different stats. And of course, this does have the one-handed perk, which is a nice touch. Versus the bugs, this does do a nice job, especially being able to run while firing at the same time. I find this to be a little bit better than the base Liberator, but not enough to get upgraded to a different level. I will be giving it a B. Versus the bots, it's a similar story. This will do the trick with decent recoil, and it does pair well with the ballistic shield to take down bots while allowing you to block some shots. This is solid, and it does have a place versus the bots, so I will be giving it a B. Now moving on to the SMG 72 Pummeler, which is sort of a mix between the Defender and the Liberator Concussive. It has a slower fire rate than the Defender, but did not get a damage buff like the Defender did, and that widened the gap between these two. The Pummeler does have the ability though to stun targets, although not as well as it used to on release, which still bothers me a little bit. This used to be able to stun chargers, but not so much anymore. The main problem with this too is that you need to sustain fire on one target in order to keep them stunned and to keep them from moving, which is unlike the Concussive, which will just push enemies back with a single bullet. Because of this, you will need to use this in a single targeting capacity and really focus in on one bug at a time. And I like that quite a bit less because when facing off against the Horde, you kind of have to keep your eye and bullets on multiple targets at once. I will say it's still nice for being useful against the Stalkers though, so it gets a few points there. It's just not the best, so I will give it a B. Now versus the bots, I do think this does a little bit better of a job because the stun is there to help you with some of the bots, and single firing is more viable on that front because you're just dealing with smaller number of enemies. Stronger enemies, but smaller number. I also like that you can use this to do things like stun the Hulks completely, and it pairs well with the ballistic shield, and I also like to use this with the anti-material rifle, using the anti-material rifle kind of in place of my primary and just having this as a nice backup to stun and keep enemies at bay. Despite being a decent choice for this one specific class, that's not enough to really give it a high grade here, but it's still decent. I will give it a B versus the bots. But now on to the SG8 Punisher shotgun, which is a light armor shotgun with rounds reload, meaning you reload individually and can reload at any point without losing an entire mag. This has great stagger like the Concussive, but it also dishes out a lot more damage. And this means that you can kill a lot of the little guys with one shot while staggering enemies that may need multiple shots to take down. Being able to reload this at any time without losing bullets is also a huge plus, as sometimes you just need to get a few quick shots off before you are actually done reloading. It's a very solid gun versus the bugs, so I will be giving it an A. Versus the bots, it's a similar story, as this does feel powerful and has good stagger, and it does decently well. The main issue though is it's just light armor penetrating, and so while it does have some good impact, it's not going to be able to deal with everything. And one thing I've noticed is a lot of times the shots can end up grazing targets and really not hit them fully, and that can be a bit of a bother. It's good, but it's just not the best. I will be giving it a B for the bots. But now let's move on to the SG8S Slugger, and this is basically a variant of the Punisher, working much the same way, although it has less damage traded off for a higher medium armor penetration level. And this does decently versus the bugs, but because there's less medium armor enemies on the bug side, the lower damage does make it a bit weaker than the Punisher overall versus most enemies. It does have good stagger force, and it can at times feel powerful, but it's just not as good as the Punisher on this front, and so I will be giving it a B. For the bots, this does feel a lot nicer. The medium armor penetration comes much more in handy, and the stagger is very strong, and it can be put to good use here. I will say again, the downside is that there does seem to be grazing shots sometimes, making it feel like you need to dish out a ton more damage to the enemies, but it's still pretty solid and it's going to serve you pretty well. It has a decent range as well, and it just feels powerful. So I will be giving this an A versus the bots. Now for the SG-20 Halt, and this is very unique. This is a shotgun that has two modes, stun and fletchette, and I don't know if I said that right, but both of these rounds are sitting in two separate magazines of 8, where when you're reloading, those bullets get applied to whichever mode you happen to have equipped. So you can use all of one mode if you wish, but you will still have at least one magazine of the other. And this is interesting. The stun rounds do perform a great deal of stun, operating very similarly to like a stun grenade or even the Pummeler. But these rounds do not nearly do as much damage, and it's only going to be penetrating at light armor levels. The flechette rounds, on the other hand, do perform a decent amount of damage, a bit in between that of the Punisher and the Slugger, and it will do so at medium armor penetration, but at less stagger than those other two. So with this gun, you're going to be finding yourself switching between the two modes depending on the situation you are in. Now versus the bugs, I'm a bit mixed here. The stun rounds can stun most bugs with one shot, leaving them frozen for a bit, but they also don't do too much damage. And this leaves you realistically wanting to switch after you stun them, perhaps to either the fletchette rounds or your sidearm. And this will take a lot of coordination in order to pull off, especially switching to fletchette, which may have you fumbling in the heat of the moment against the horde. While it definitely can be nice to freeze a hunter in place or even a bile spewer, you are kind of left needing to switch, and so you will need to be pretty good with your timing to get it right, and you'll need to be able to find a flow when facing multiple enemies in the horde, especially because there isn't much spread on this, so you can't really stun like the whole horde in front of you like you could with a stun grenade. Now, you can also stun a charger, which is nice, but it will take a few shots out of this thing, and it seems like it still allows the charger the ability to turn back fully before they get stunned, which in some ways defeats some of the purpose of this. But when they do get stunned, they do stay there for a bit of time, which is nice, so you can have your way with them. I also tried stunning by shooting underneath them, but that doesn't really seem to work, at least not very well. Now, the other thing here is you can't stun a Bile Titan or an Impaler from what I can see. If you can, it's going to take a good number of shots. Now, with the flechette rounds, this does have good medium damage, but only a little bit of stagger with it. So in some ways, I feel like it's a weaker Punisher, and personally in this case, I honestly would rather have my bullets do some stagger with high damage versus being able to stun them and having to coordinate a switch. That leaves me more vulnerable to the rest of the horde. This is still nice, and I do love the versatility and the creativity with this gun. It's just not the best in my opinion, so I will give it a B for the bugs. Now versus the bots, there are also some pros and cons. The stun rounds can be great for stopping enemies like the berserkers in their tracks, but of course it won't do much damage to them, so you can switch to the fletchette rounds to finish them off pretty nicely. Another thing I really like to do is you can use the stun rounds to stun a Devastator, freezing them in place, and then I quickly switch to my Senator for a cool looking finish to the head. But one thing I will say that's a bit disappointing here is that the stun rounds can't affect the medium enemies like the Rocket Striders, and I don't think it would be OP for it to be able to actually do this. Instead, it would operate a little bit more like a stun bomb because the damage is very low. Now, at least you can use the fletchette rounds versus the Rocket Striders, but of course without any of those stun benefits. You can also stun a Hulk from the back, which is definitely cool because you can keep them in place for a while and finish them off, but you still need to get behind them in order to do this, which takes away some of the appeal here, as often that's what you want the stun for, is to be able to get around a Hulk. And so I do wish you could stun them from the front. I don't think that would actually be OP because you still would have to go around them and deal damage with something else. Overall though, I still think it's a pretty solid option to take out with you against the bots. I do like that you're able to stun a lot of these guys, and I like that you have the option to dish out medium armor damage, and having some versatility is always welcome. So I will be giving it an A for the bots. But now let's move on to the SG 451 Cookout, and this is another Punisher variant, but with incendiary rounds, and this one is very awesome versus the bugs. This has similar benefits to the Punisher with these impactful, staggering shots, but it also lights the enemies on fire, and this does quick work of the bugs. What I love is that you can pepper shots in and let the fire damage that you have expelled do the finishing touches. With a good amount of stagger too, this pushes a lot of these guys back and it just makes you feel untouchable. This is definitely an S top tier gun versus the bugs. Now versus the bots, though, this will struggle mostly because the added fire benefits don't really seem to impact them nearly as much. And it also is light armor penetrating, so it's not really going to help with a lot of the medium armor. In general, it feels like a weaker version of the Slugger, but it does kind of feel about on the same level as the Punisher, just trading off some damage over time effects versus raw damage of the Punisher. It really falls about the same level, and so I'll be giving it a B versus the bots. But now we have the SG 225 Breaker Shotgun, and this is interesting because this was once the meta shotgun, and it did get a nerf that took it down a peg, but it has now received another buff in magazine size and stagger force, and honestly, I do think this has restored the gun to a lot of its former glory. This is very good against the bug horde, and the full auto means you don't have to really time your shots that much. With a decent spread, it also bypasses a lot of the medium armor that you encounter as well. This is very good, but I will say compared to some of the other guns that are on this list, I think it now just narrowly misses being an S tier, but I will give it a high A for the bugs. Now versus the bots, I am less impressed. It can be good for close range, and it does a little bit of stagger damage, which can be nice, but it also does not do that medium armor penetration, which ultimately just doesn't make it feel that strong. And it doesn't have the same level of stagger that something like the Punisher does, which would otherwise help this gun's case. I think for me, it doesn't feel too great to use. I will give it a C versus the bots. But now we have the SG 225 SP Breaker Spray and Pray, which is a breaker variant, and it is one of those notorious guns which was pretty poop when it came out. But it did receive some nice buffs along with the spread being more horizontal, and this inherently will make your spread reach out to more of the horde and dish out more damage. And yeah, this actually does feel pretty decent versus the horde, being able to deal with multiple at once, and you literally do spray and pray with this thing. I still think the breaker is a better option of the two, but this is still pretty good, and I will be giving it an A for the bugs. Now versus the bots, there's really nothing good about this. There's no redeeming qualities, and you're basically just going to exhaust all your bullets and still be left not having killed the target. This is the purest of the pure poop. Get flushed. But now we have another breaker variant, the SG 225 IE Breaker Incendiary, and this is a burst firing shotgun that shoots flame bullets, and this is actually very amazing versus the bugs, who get impacted quite nicely with fire. All you need to do is burst fire to a few of these guys and let the damage over time take effect. And what's great is that just allows you to stay mobile while the bugs ultimately weaken and die. Feels great to use, it's excellent in fact, and so yes, this does get an S versus the bugs. Now versus the bots, it's a much different story. Bots do not get impacted as much from the flames, and while you can use the damage over time effects to your advantage, it does seem to take quite a bit longer. The flames are offering no real major advantages here, and so it does feel pretty weak and just kind of feels kind of pointless to have with you when you have other things that can just inflict more damage. It's not total poop, but it's not that great. I will be giving it a C for the bots. But now we have the CB9 Exploding Crossbow, and I think that after a lot of balancing changes, this is finally in a top tier spot. This thing has a lot going for it. It can close the bug holes. It does wide explosive damage that also staggers enemies. It also just does a lot of damage in general, and it can be shot one-handed and quicker than perhaps the closest gun to it, which is the Eruptor. This thing is just very solid, and really the biggest downside is that there is some slight bullet drop, which you will just have to train and get used to, but once you do, you will be wrecking the bugs for days. I think this can serve you really well, and so this gets an S tier for the bugs. And versus the bots, this also does really well. Being one-handed allows you to actually take this with a ballistic shield, which will help you with incoming fire, and that is amazing. You can also one-shot Devastator heads, as well as just fire into a bunch and stagger a bunch of enemies back. The splash damage is nice. You can take out multiple enemies with it, and this has just gotten better and better as arrow Arrowhead has updated it. You can also shoot Scout Striders from the front, which is amazing, and adding in the ability to actually destroy fabricators makes it super solid. This is definitely an S tier for the bots. But now we have the R36 Eruptor, and this is an interesting one. This is basically a sniper rifle with a slow rate of fire that shoots these powerful explosive shots that releases shrapnel as well. And when this came out, this was definitely an S tier gun. It was super strong, but it got nerfed where it had its shrapnel removed, and subsequently it was buffed a couple times. And finally, it's gotten it back. And I will say that it is in a very strong state at this point. The shrapnel now explodes in this huge fireworks type explosion, and this allows for many enemies to be killed at once. Chargers are not going to be able to be one shot with this thing like they used to, but you can get them in about 3 shots to the butt, and shooting under them damages their butts as well. This thing also has great utility, of course, being able to close bug holes. I do think this is in pretty great shape, although it's still not as good as it was upon release, although this is probably the closest that it will ever get. Just make sure to bring a stalwart or something for the closer enemies so you don't damage yourself. It's pretty solid. I will be giving it an A versus the bugs. Now for the bots, I find this to be pretty solid as well. And I will say the addition of shrapnel hasn't changed it too much in my eyes. At least I feel it's less noticeable because the bots tend to clump up a little bit less than the bugs. The powerful explosions in these things do a good, decent job taking out the bots though. Rocket Striders can be taken out pretty reliably in about 2 shots to their medium crotch, and 1 shot pretty reliably for the walkers at level 7 and below. And Devastators are taken out quickly as well. This is also one of the best primaries for dealing with the gunships, and I love that. Splash damage is great, so if you do have bots clumped up, it will help. And of course, the utility is there, being able to take out fabricators. This is going to get an A for the bots. Now we have the SG-8P Punisher Plasma, or the PP as I like to call it. It's basically this grenade launcher variant of the Scorcher, and it's pretty strong, shooting these plasma bombs that explode and can actually hurt you as well. This thing is a beast. It really does well versus the bugs, as the explosions not only take multiple enemies out at once, but they also stagger them back. Major downside with this is while it is explosive, it won't close the bug holes. It's still very good though, pretty solid, and nice that you can use this to splash damage chargers as well, even shooting them from underneath. I will be giving it an A for the bugs. Versus the bots, I find this to be pretty great as well. The explosions provide stagger to the enemies, and the splash damage can be great for taking multiple enemies out at once. Takes out the Striders pretty quickly, and generally just feels pretty great to have on you. Playing at range versus the bots means you do need to have a little bit of control over the arc pattern of this thing, but once you get the hang of it, it's not that bad. The stagger and the splash are one of the best things here because, of course, it helps keep multiple enemies staggered, and that can help keep yourself safe. I will say the damage per shot on this sometimes can feel like things just aren't getting damaged enough, and so can sometimes feel like you need too many shots for the enemies. And while I once had this as an S tier, when you compare it to the other 2 plasma weapons that I will get to, I think this ends up falling quite a bit short, and so I'll be giving it a high A for the bots. Still very solid. Now we have the ARC 12 Blitzer, and this is very interesting, especially because many people will tell you this is an S tier weapon versus at least the bugs. But to be honest, I'm not completely sold on that. This thing fires these arcs that blitz to multiple enemies, and it does have some good stagger as well. It has infinite ammo, which can be held down for full auto firing, and it also ramps up the stun as it fires on targets. It is very strong, and it does do very well versus the Horde, especially at holding them back. I will say a downside to this though is the time between shots can feel long, and can be long enough for the enemies to close the gap and ultimately get you. You can do things like diving back while shooting, as well as just running around, staying mobile in between shots. That can definitely help, but to me, I feel like I just want to be dishing out the damage a little bit faster when facing off against the Horde. Certainly, many will tell you it's an S, but for me, it's an A for the bugs. Now versus the bots, it's also pretty good, as it does stagger the medium enemies very well, and it similarly is very good for crowd control. I do like that you can also render a group of Devastators or Berserkers pretty much stunned perpetually until you kill them, and you don't even really need to aim that much to do so. This also will get at the walkers pretty nicely, stunning these bad boys. Now, this does lack range, which you do need more often versus the bots, but I will say it can be a great thing to have with you when you're supporting a team and you want to just help control the crowds. I will be giving it an A for the bots. Now let's move on to the LAS-5 Scythe, and this is a weapon that emits a continuous laser beam which deals damage to the enemies that are in its path, and it also deals fire damage to those enemies, which creates a damage over time effect. And this of course can really hurt the bugs, taking at least the little guys out pretty quickly. But I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of this weapon versus the Terminids, because you do have to hold down on just a little bit on each enemy, and it makes you really focused in on single targeting, when to me, you want to be facing off against the horde. You kind of want to be tracking multiple enemies at once. Now, what's interesting is I really like the Las Rover backpack, but with this, you don't really have to control it. You can just allow that to focus in its efforts on enemies for you and not have to be the one focusing in, giving the option for other enemies to come and get you from other angles. One particular highlight of this is it does do pretty well versus the Shriekers. I know there's a lot of fans of these laser guns, and I do think it's gotten much stronger, but it just doesn't really do it for me versus the bugs, so I will be giving it a C. Now versus the bots, I do like this a bit more. The little guys go out very quickly, almost instantly, and it doesn't take much to get the Berserkers or the Devastators in their heads. The infinite ammo on this is also a very strong thing, and since you have a smaller number of targets to deal with, you can focus a little bit more on single targeting, and it doesn't suffer in the same way as it does versus the bugs. This will suffer though in that it is light armor penetrating, so you will need to be very precise with your targeting. Now for me, I kind of go back and forth on whether to give a light armor penetrating weapon an A when so many of the bots have medium armor. But I will say the extreme precision and the infinite ammo do make this at least among the best light armor guns to take with you versus the bots, especially the fact that you do have some secondary options like the Senator and the Verdict to help deal with some of the medium or even heavy armor situations that you might face. For that, I might be a little bit generous here, but I will eke this up to an A for the bots. Now let's move on to the LAS-16 Sickle, and this is an interesting gun, being sort of an assault rifle, but having lower damage than most and next to no recoil, as well as infinite ammo. And I know a lot of people are fans of this gun, but versus the bugs, I am not a huge fan. The wind-up time really hurts your ability to react to the horde's attacks, and having to focus so much on managing your coil's heat levels keeps you focused too much on other things than just fighting. The cooldown on this can also feel a little bit slow, and I know you can use this pretty well at range, but the opportunities for that are fewer and farther between in the bug fights. I can see this as being a little bit of a medium range suppression weapon, especially using the infinite ammo to your advantage, but I just don't think that's enough to really save it for me, especially for the bugs. I want to have something that's going to have my back in the most dangerous times, and I just don't think the Sickle really will do that. So I will be giving this a C for the bugs. Now versus the bots, this does fare quite a bit better in my eyes. Because of its low recoil, it has amazing precision versus the bots and can take them out at range quite quickly. I also like that versus the Scout Striders on level 7 and below, you can pop their heads as they peek above armor. Now because of the way gameplay goes with the bots, I don't feel the impact so much with the wind-up time, as I don't feel you really need to have as much of a twitch reaction as you do versus an incoming bug horde. Now, not being able to penetrate medium armor definitely makes it a bit tougher, but for the same reasons as the Scythe, where you can pair with a medium or heavy sidearm, as well as the extreme precision here and being able to use something like the unflinching perk to control that, I will also eke this up to an A for the bots. But let's move on to the Plaz 1 Scorcher, which has always been a great gun and is definitely worth the metal grind to achieve. This was a semi-auto plasma shooter which shoots out explosions that can actually hurt you as well, but now this also has the ability to shoot full auto, as well as having more ammo now in its mag. And versus the bugs, this just feels so nice to use. It takes nearly everything out very quickly, and you can deal with everything. The snappy aim gets you on your target fast, and it's actually one of the fastest primaries that can take a charger out from the butt. It can do so in less than one mag. Now, being able to shoot full auto is nice, but it isn't that much of a game changer, as you can shoot just as fast with its single fire pattern. But one of the biggest game changers here is actually the mag size, which was one of the biggest complaints about this gun, and that you constantly felt like you were reloading. And so this is very welcome. Now, one of the downsides you might notice is, especially with the hunters, as they get close to you and you try to fire at them, you may end up splashing and damaging yourself. But with the snappy aim and being focused on trying to take them out first, you can get them pretty fast and get them out of the way. And even if they do end up getting a bit close, it seems that they have changed the self splash damage a little bit, such that you don't end up killing yourself in one close shot anymore. It does seem to take a couple, and so it does seem like even if you do have to take care of one of these enemies very close, you'll ultimately be okay. I don't know when or if they change this at some point, but it's definitely something that I've noticed here. Overall though, I love this gun. It just feels too good. It takes out all the enemies quickly. I gotta do it. This is an S tier versus the bugs. Now versus the bots, this somehow is even better. Being mostly at range eliminates much of that explosion risk that you might have on the bugs, but it also wrecks everything and quickly. The explosions actually reach past armor so that you can shoot directly at things like walkers and the shielded Devastator shields and still be able to take them out quickly. This also did get a slight nerf in that you can't really directly hit the shredder tanks from the front anymore, and I think that's kind of lame and annoying, but you can still kind of hit it at the side to get some explosions to creep around, and it still will get them very quickly. Same thing here with the Annihilator tanks. If you can get an angle where the splash will hit their backside, you will take them out quickly. And even the gunships, it's pretty rare for a primary weapon to be able to take these out quickly, but this will do the trick. Ultimately, this is just amazing. The handling is great. The snappiness is great. A lot of times it just feels like you're on easy mode when you take this out. That's why this easily gets an S for the bots. But now let's move on to the Plaz 101 Purifier, which is very interesting. This is a Scorcher variant that has gone through some changes. You used to only have the ability to shoot as a charge up weapon, firing these explosive plasma shots at a very slow rate of fire. But now it also has the option to fire these smaller shots at an extremely fast rate. And while this once was very deep in the pooper, this has climbed out from the clutches and somehow propelled itself to the top of these lists. Like, this gun is awesome. The fast firing rate is very fast, like as fast as your trigger finger will allow. And this means that you can completely melt enemies, even the stronger ones. Like, look at what this thing does to the charger butts. They are just completely done. Similarly, you can use this to take out things like the impalers very quickly, and the bile spewers can be taken out very quickly. This will also damage the horde very well, giving you the option to either charge up and shoot into the horde for big explosive shots that will take multiple enemies out at the expense of only one bullet, or fire these bullets off quickly for less damage but super fast medium armor penetrating damage. The handling on this thing is a bit worse and sluggish than that of the Scorcher, but it's not enough to be a game-breaking issue. I'm actually worried this might end up getting nerfed, but I hope Arrowhead has learned the lesson that it's not really a big deal to have some powerful guns. I love this, and while I am a little bit biased, I do like the Scorcher more on a personal level, I do have to recognize that this is the king. And yes, this is top S tier. Now, for the bots, this actually continues to astound me with how good this is. This thing, just like the Scorcher, reaches past armor to get shielded Devastators and walkers, but this has two key advantages. One, you can hold down the fire rate for splash and stagger to multiple enemies that may end up being clumped together, being able to take multiple out at once. And I will say the charge up also seems to be maybe the best approach for taking the gunships out quicker. At least that's what it seemed to be in my testing. But you can do either or. But the other thing here is the super fast fire rate, which is especially good versus the heat sinks. So if a Hulk even exposes their back a little bit to you, he's gone. If you see a shredder tank and you have any sort of angle, he gone. Turret towers, gone. Both of them, gone. Annihilator tanks, annihilated. Just amazing and versatile. And please don't nerf this. Now, I will say the slight disadvantage versus the Scorcher is the handling, and the single bullets that you're firing without any charge do seem to do less damage, as well as the mag size being smaller, but that really isn't enough. I think this wins top of the list. Started from the bottom, now it's all the way at the top. S tier versus the bots. Okay, now let's move on to the Flam 66 Torture, and this is essentially a primary version of the flamethrower, and flames of course really hurt the bugs, making this a pretty strong weapon to take out versus them. And the awesome thing here is that you can also use this to take out a charger from the front, being the only primary that has this ability right now. I will say the flame damage on this feels a bit slow, and so I do kind of feel like if you do want a flamethrower by your side, you might be better with the crisper sidearm or the stronger flamethrower stratagem. Either way though, this is good. It's a great option to have at least, and so I will give it an A versus the bugs. Now versus the bots, it's not so great because flames are just not super effective on bots, but that is to be expected. One thing I do like though is you can use this to shoot walkers dead on and the flames will get them. You can also take out a Hulk with this head on, but it will take a long time and it's not really worth the effort if I'm being honest. Now another thing here is you can use this to battle a clump of enemies at closer range, dealing some damage over time effects to them, but it still kind of feels like it takes a while and you will have to get close in order for this to work. It does have some cool things going for it, which makes it avoid the flush, but still not super great. I will be giving it a C for the bots. But now we have the Jar 5 Dominator, and this is actually one of my favorite guns in the game. It's a semi-auto firing gun which dishes out a lot of damage and stagger. It does great versus the bugs. It packs a huge punch, has great stagger, as well as medium armor penetration. Now this thing does have some tough handling, which can cause you to miss some shots, but there does feel like enough bullets in the mag that it won't hurt you too bad. This does feel very great. It has great impact versus everything, and I love how it dishes out a lot of damage and stagger to keep the horde at bay. You really can't go wrong if you have this on you, and I will be giving it an A for the bugs. Now versus the bots, the Jar just completely dominates, pun intended. You can take out Scout Striders by hitting their medium crotch. You can one-shot Devastators in the head or just take them out with a few shots to the body. The heat sinks are taken out very quickly. It's honestly just so satisfying to use. The only main drawback here is that some of the handling makes it a little bit harder to use at range, but you can counter that with first person view or the peak physique perk. Overall, this is a top tier gun and this gets an S for me for the bots. And so with that, we have our lists. This is the primary weapon tier list versus the bugs, and this is the primary weapon tier list versus the bots. I have to say, a lot of these changes Arrowhead has made are great, making a lot of guns very viable and strong, and it's starting to make my lists a little bit top heavy, so perhaps I will have to start putting some tougher criteria in. But regardless, this is actually awesome and a great place for the game to be in. What's really important here is that most of these guns feel great to use and they feel like true primaries. But where do you rank these weapons? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you to my YouTube members for joining the Bowel Movement. But otherwise, so long, Pooper Troopers.